The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails. And then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shimmied and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life here and will drown, the captain said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvelousness as he had known. Now, this is Seamus Heaney, who is, I presume, the best-known poet writing in English since Yeats died, who was the best-known poet in the first half of the 20th century. And the poem is based on 8th century. Different sources had proposed the dates from 743, 744, 748, and 49, when men in ships, and literally ships with sails and anchors, as you can tell from the point, were seen in the air over Ireland. There were a number of such reports. And these are recorded in the annals of, well, Clonard Noyes, that added, the Four Masters, the annals of Ulster in Northern Ireland, and so on. To date, the range of attestation, the fact that the item was first recorded in Latin, all of these argue for a contemporary notice of an anomalous event. Now, true or not true, this is an epiphany. For certain, it's a mystery. But it is an early report, pre-scientific report, of extraterrestrial intelligence. I don't know whether there's one before the 8th century in Ireland or not. There may be, but I'm not aware of it. Culture. Now, there are, what, 45 people in the room here. If we asked you to define culture, we'd probably come up with 45 more or less different, more or less the same kinds of answers. Let me define it. It seems to me that culture is defined by 3 characteristics, 3 requirements. It derives from 3 aspects. The first is language. Without language, there's no culture, as we know. The second is story, which is based on language. And the third is community, which is based on language and story. So keep that in mind as we're going along through here. It begins with language, and as Guy said last night in the program, in the beginning was the word. Well, I'm going to begin with the word nevermore. Now, I hasten to add, this is not about SETI. This is not a conclusion at all. It comes from context here, as Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Quote, the raven nevermore. Okay, why the raven? Well, let's think about this. It begins once upon a midnight dreary while I pondered, weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. This is midnight. This is a man sitting in a study in his chamber, maybe his bedroom, that's where he works. And he's pondering over manuscripts or old volumes. He hears the tapping. In the 7th stanza, which is about 40% of the way through the poem, the raven gets in through the window. He's been trying to find him for where he is. And the raven flies and settles, perches on the bust of Pallas. This is Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom and civilization. So at this point, we ought to realize, I think, that this man is a scholar. He's probably a scientist in a pre-sort of scientific, certainly not the kind of science as we know it today. He's reading. Perhaps he'd be called a natural scientist from this period. The raven is symbolic in various cultures. In Norse culture, Odin was said to have owned 2 ravens, and they represented thought and memory. So again, this is thought, memory, wisdom, civilization. This is culture. And the last, or the most significant question, not the last, that the scholar asks the raven is there balm in Gilead? In reference to a biblical question, and of course the answer is evermore. Why Poe? Well, it seems to me that Poe reflects the culture, the educational climate that all of us grew up in, even those of you who may still be in your 20s. Certainly anybody over 35. This is the way that people are brought up, taught, and learned. It's literacy. It's a literate culture. There are books. at the outset. And it reflects a time, Poe was writing in the 1840s, let's say mid-19th century, a time when all of us learned by books. Culture was literate, and it led through from the oral to the literate written tradition, and to such transitions in science from Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Spinoza, Leibniz, and so on along the way. There's a lot that happened that Poe sort of situates, for me at least, cultural transitions here. Because up to before Poe, we've got Protestant Reformation, we've got Spanish Inquisition, and any number of other religious movements and traditions that develop and disappear. We have Columbus and the Age of Discovery. We've got Goethe and Beethoven and Wordsworth, a development from epic poetry, Greek, Roman, even up into Milton, Paradise Lost, for example, to lyric poetry and somebody like Wordsworth. We've got the development of the novel, which came about late 17th century, 18th century. John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, the Enlightenment. All of this is precursor to Edgar Allan Poe. The French and the American Revolutions. When Poe comes along, this is an era of Darwin, of industrial revolution, scientific revolution following. Alice in Wonderland. Poe is known for his poetry. He's also better known for his detective stories. And these are haunting, these are mysteries. Many of them are quite chilling. Many of them are based in some scientific or medical kind of phenomenon. So there's an awareness there of change in the world. And leading out of here, we've got Arthur Russell, Wittgenstein, keep going forward, Whitehead, for example, later on. Stravinsky and The Rite of Spring, late 1890s. And The Rite of Spring was performed, premiered in Paris, 97, 98, 99, somewhere in that period. The atone, the cacophonous, created riots in the Symphony Hall in Paris. People were hitting each other with canes. And less than a year later, the second performance of The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky, the human ear had accommodated itself, had retrained itself to hear Stravinsky. And he was applauded with great acclaim, and we all know that this was a phenomenal transition in musical history that took place as a consequence of his work. This is also a period when electricity is being used, lights, telephones, radio, moving pictures, all come out of here. Leading up to World Wars I and II, and Alva, to Einstein, to an extraordinary global awareness of politics, of society, of civilizations, of cultures that most people were unaware of until the World Wars brought them into focus. And finally, to another huge transition. We've been up to Poe, from Gutenberg, essentially up to Poe, Poe up to the World Wars. Then, and then we have the atomic age, the Manhattan Project, the moon landing, which was a hoax in the minds of many Americans. They thought it was a governmental hoax. Although I personally saw it from the ground, so I suppose it could still be a hoax. I was standing outside of an appliance television store in Athens, and they had turned all of the televisions to face the street so that people could stop and see them. And all of the bars, all of the taverns, all of the restaurants were filled with people. And there were American flags on every single corner in Athens for the moon landing. So that was my experience of it. Was this atomic age the most transformative, the most disruptive of human culture in human history? Perhaps it was. It disrupted fiction. James Joyce's Ulysses is probably one good example of that. The Cultural Revolution in China takes place in this period and out. And then there's another huge transition that takes place as a consequence of these developments, the atomic age. And that's SETI is in this period. It's artificial intelligence. It's an explosion of development As we think about 500 years of Gutenberg, for example, and all of a sudden we're moving in a relatively few decades from the atomic era into artificial intelligence into the world that we know more or less today. The pace of change is exploding. Something else that changed as well in this period, and toward the 1980 or so, we had been for centuries, millennia, an oral culture. People got their information by talking to each other, passing it down. Beginning with Gutenberg, manuscripts of course proceeded, but they were not generally available. Beginning with Gutenberg, we had a transformation in the way that people gain their knowledge and the value they place on it, and the movement across broad numbers of people and the involvement of essentially the whole Western world in literate culture, which didn't exist pre-Gutenberg. But all of a sudden, about 80 or so, 1980 or so, we were moving into another oral culture again, and the one that we are now developing here. Books represented a hierarchical universe. This is David Brooks writing in the New York Times. The internet, an egalitarian universe. And Walter Hahn, who's a philosopher, described it as a secondary orality. In other words, you have primary orality up through Gutenberg, then we have literate reality, then we have secondary orality, or getting secondary orality means essentially the internet and the kind of communication that we have nowadays. It's an interesting, Trent Batson, writing in a campus technology online journal, describes in the large picture of human history the brief few centuries when print reigned unchallenged as the most revered form of knowledge. What we've seen is a mere parenthesis. And Tom Pettit, who's an associate professor of English in southern Denmark, described this as the Gutenberg parenthesis. It's 500 years out of 6,000 plus of human history. So it really is a minor piece. What did writers do before the parenthesis? They sampled, they mixed, they borrowed, they shaped, they appropriated, they contextualized and recontextualized. In folklore, this was called quilting, or simply the development of the oral presentation, epic, of any kind of text for that matter. And now on campuses, educators call it plagiarism. Before Gutenberg, humanity mostly shared knowledge through the spoken word, what is called orality. But now humanity is beginning to understand, once again, I'm quoting here from Trent Batson, with the internet, that knowledge is communal. The parenthesis was the anomaly. The internet is not the anomaly. We're not losing knowledge and learning values, we're reclaiming knowledge and learning values. Only now, with Web 2.0, do we get a concrete demonstration of the social structuring of knowledge and the multiple threads that directly or indirectly lead to any single expression of the synthesis of those threads. A couple of you know that I was teaching on semester C a year ago right now. Actually, Paul and Danny were there. I think we were in Morocco about this moment. And there's very little technology on board the ship. It's limited. The students have limited access. They have to pay for it beyond something. And the student with a research paper was really struggling. And he went into the library because he couldn't find anything and he didn't have the money to use the web and pay for it at an exorbitant fee. And the librarian said, well, we have some books here that might be helpful to you. And she said, come on back. And they went back and found 3 books. And she said, I think you ought to start with this one. And handed it to him. He came back and put it on the counter at the library while she went back to get a card and sign it up for him. And when she came back, he was looking at the book. And he said, I don't know how to use this. And she said, well, I'd suggest you start with the index. What's he say? Where's the index? What's that? Now that's an extreme example, no question about it. But it is true that many people are not tuned to books anymore. There's a wonderful Onion piece that came out about a year ago about the nation. The title is "Nation Shudders at Large Block of Uninterrupted Text." Americans collectively recoiled Monday when confronted with a solid block of uninterrupted text. Why won't he just tell me what it's about? Where are the bullet points? Where are the highlighted parts? I've looked everywhere, and there's nothing here but words. So this is another huge transition. And this one may, in fact, be a greater transition, it seems to be, in American world culture than the whole development of the atomic age. Does or can SETI lead in this area? We move from literacy and back to orality, along with the loss of thousands of languages. And you realize that we lose hundreds of languages, even thousands every year in the world. The loss of thousands of languages, and hence their stories and the communities, the tribal cultures that were the primary cultures of the world for years and still were all the way up into the late 20th century. Even religions are disappearing. We moved from a humanistic culture, my world, to a technological culture. From local to national and even nationalistic to global. We moved from diversity to homogeneity and to inevitable conflict along the way as well. When languages disappear, so do stories and communities. Is intelligence, our own or extraterrestrial intelligence, advanced so that the future doesn't involve place? Place becomes irrelevant. Intelligence is no longer located or confined to place or even to time. Is intelligence then shared as part of a new kind of community in our own immediate future, a digital community rather than a local place-based community? Have we reached a stage when the limits of human imagination are greater than the limits of our technology to act? Is our culture not limited to place or time, to proximity or intimacy, and therefore is global or even intergalactical? So one challenge is to weave a new kind of web, a new kind of access that opens the world of imagination and creativity, that expands knowledge, that recognizes story. Humans, after all, are storytellers. And that recognizes, too, as the title of one book was mentioned the other day, we're not gadgets. We have lives. And I will come to a conclusion here by cutting out a few things, but it seems to me that we're finding ourselves confronting what is an old sort of paradox or development. Jürgen Habermas, sociologist, philosopher, described it as the world, the life world, and systems. And the life world was what we would think of. That's community, that's religion, that's family, that's story, that's kind of world that all of us grew up in small town America along the way somewhere. And the systems that he describes, and this is a good 40 years back now, were the market economy and the administrative state. The life world is based in language. The system world is based on other kinds of locuses. The market economy is based on money. The administrative state is based on power. But the third one, and it's developed since this article was written, is clearly technology, the technology system, and it's based in machines. And it leads us to wonder what effect it's going to have to the culture that becomes a machine-driven culture, machine-powered culture, machine-controlled culture. The way of connecting with people is through machine. It's intermediated, it's a mediated, rather than a direct human life world kind of culture. And Robert Bellah, writing about Habermas, says no one can live by the dollar sign and the power quotient that we would add by the machine. We still are who we are because religion, tradition, community has somehow managed to survive in the face of all disruptions the last 100 years. Our task is to preserve the remnants. And I would say one of the things that has impressed me about this conference and about SETI is that in spite of the fact that SETI is driven by technology, it is not divorced from this language-based culture. This is one of the most story-oriented, identity, meaning-oriented groups of people that I've ever encountered. You're probably a whole lot better than the folks in the humanities are at working together, at collaborating, at being partners, at seeing a collective kind of intelligence. You've good humor, goodwill, diverse perspectives, the fact that I'm here, bizarre, it seems, I think makes SETI have the possibility that it can bridge this gap between what Habermas was talking about, the life world, and the system world, and that it ultimately is positive and it will lead to what it needs to lead to for the future of SETI. I'm going to leave you with a poem, which I'll hand out because it's too long, that I really just stumbled upon recently because it's just published. It's one page per. This is by Robert Hayden, published by the American Academy of Poets. Here among them, the Americans, this baffling multi-people. It's an alien speaking. Extremes and variegations, their noisy restlessness, their almost frightening energy. How best describe these aliens in my reports? He talks about the multiple races, the colors, the imprecise and strangery distinctions by which they live, by which they justify their cruelties to one another. But by the end of the poem, he's come around to thinking, you know, there's still fascinating people we are out here in the world. And finally, one more poet. I am an American literature in poetry, but not an American. Rilke, German, and not a poem. Letters to a Young Poet that I think is appropriate as we conclude this conference about SETI. Be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves. This reminds me of Frank's, are we at the end or are we at the beginning of the slide this morning? Do not seek answers that cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will gradually, without noticing it, live along St. Francisco Day into the answers. So, thanks.
Thank you. So many thoughts.
Steve, why don't you come up and get ready while we're...
Okay.
Reactions? Over well.
Mike.
I'm thrilled with the positive report. We do like one another. So this is a response from the community. And there's something missing in the American mindset at the moment. The thrill that in fact we have been so successful that China, India, Brazil, and soon others will pull themselves up by their bootstraps because of our efforts. And I think we should be very, very more positive about that cultural transmission than we have been. Instead, we're frightened that the renminbi is still blah, blah, blah. I'm really positive about the future.
So am I.
And you're helping.
Oh,
Thank you.
You're helping too.
Okay, thanks again.
Steve Dick will tell us, give us some societal thoughts.